Good evening to you once again. On the business desk at this hour, the rise in South Africa's unemployment rate to 32.9% has not come as a shock to analysts, as the 8% jump in joblessness is driven mainly by losses in the community and social services, construction, as well as finance industries. According to Stats SA's quarterly labour force survey, 8 of the country's 9 provinces contributed negatively, with Limpopo leading the pack and the Free State remaining unchanged. This means the number of South Africans without jobs now stands at 8.2 million. Meanwhile, the country's youth aged between 15 and 34 remain the most vulnerable, with an increase in unemployment among this group having accelerated to 4.9 million. At the same time, the number of unemployed graduates has increased to 11.8%. CEO at Afrika Tikkun, Onyi Nwaneri, speaks to us about this element and the broader concern over joblessness in South Africa. Good evening to you, Onyi. A picture that is worsening in South Africa. Where are we going wrong?
Oh, well, I believe, first of all, thank you for having me. I believe that the current unemployment stats is a little bit sobering. We had hoped for better news. I believe that we're going wrong because we're not really focusing as much as we should on youth-related matters. If you look at where we have had the most job losses in the NGO sector, in the community sector, services sector, in the education and social sector, you would see that the NGO sector is under pressure, and any job that has been created in those sectors have been lost. Yeah, sobering.
Sovereign it is, and as we head towards another election period in South Africa's 30 years of democracy, how should the new administration to be voted into power address this matter?
Is to put young people at the center of every decision making. We know that youth unemployment has been an issue for a very long time. It's not news to us. It's the reason why organizations like ours, Afrika Tikkun, exist to solve for youth unemployment and to work with the public, the private sector, and civil society to solve it. But at the end of the day, young people have a voice. They have the voice that can be exercised the most in deciding who would lead them. So whoever we decide is going to lead us need to understand that young people need to be put at the center of our development. We can no longer have a situation where we have one of the highest youth unemployment in the world. And in order to solve for this, we need to look for ways to create jobs. We need to look for ways to stimulate for young people to start creating jobs themselves and not just dependent on the state. And I do want to say this. I think that South African government and the private sector have done a lot. If you look at our YES program, our National Youth Service, our social employment programs, those programs have done a lot to try and help solve this problem. But the truth is that every year we have new young people coming out of universities, coming out of our high schools, and the number is increasing. And therefore, this should be our #1 priority, but with young people at the center of that decision making.
Speaking of South Africa's youth and unemployment in a way that it affects them the most, I definitely have to ask us to delve into where the challenges lie there, especially with preparing this group in the South African economy with regards to upskilling and educational skills that they would need to get to enter into markets. It has not worked. We are seeing that graduates are unemployed, but at the same time, they are still barriers of entry to higher education institutions, which then leaves out a large part of participants.
Absolutely. We have 35%, almost 40% of young people between, the age of 15 to 35, are not in education, employment, or training. What that means is that 4 out of 10 young people who are not in any education, employment, or training. That's concerning, especially because this is whom we call the future of tomorrow, the leaders of tomorrow, the people who are going to take over the running of our country. So we do have a very big problem. What are the concerns we have as Afrika Tikkun? Our concerns are that one, the economy is not growing, and we've got to work together to grow that economy. Secondly, a lot of employers are still requiring work experience. They want young people who have experience in order to give them jobs. Yet, if you don't give them jobs, they're never going to get that experience. There is still a lot of discrimination in terms of, and I understand, given limited resources, a lot of our our employers are worried about, let's employ who is going to give us bang for buck, but then you are part of the problem because you can't complain when young people take matters into their hands. So we have concerns around that intentional discrimination of young people in favor of experience. We've also gone into a gig economy where degrees are not always the answer. And I think we need to start looking at who can do the job based on the skills they have, irrespective of what qualification or certification they have. It's really about who can do the job. And then just to also add, it's one thing for people like us to exist, to say we are skilling young people. We have a massive challenge around employability of youth. We need to start looking at how do we hold training providers and people who work in spaces like Afrika Tikkun, not just to train young people, but train young people who are employable and focus on ensuring that whoever we train that graduate from our programs can actually compete in that environment. And then finally, we have a lot of jobs that is being outsourced outside of South Africa, what is being offshored. If a number of our private sector participants start bringing back those jobs into South Africa, especially in the ICT, in the digital sector, we're going to see more jobs. We're going to start seeing more jobs in the country that is brought back to help us to solve this big problem that we have. And I dare say a ticking time bomb.
The latter part of your statement becomes even more interesting when it comes to the role of the private sector in this regard. My question, though, is, in this country, is it fair to say that maybe a political will that is lacking and political policy that is directed at ensuring that there's job creation on both sides, from private business as well as the state, is just non-existent?
Well, I don't believe that political will is lacking. We know that from the president's office, the president has put in various, what you call the Presidential Youth Employment Initiative, to try and influence the job creation within the country. So I would be sorely mistaken to say that the interest of the current government is not to solve for this problem. But I believe we can do more. I believe particularly from the private sector, and that the private sector, especially in terms of requiring that work experience, if we could recognize that work experience shouldn't be the only criteria for hiring people for jobs, then we'll see a very different criteria. So I do think that political will from a private sector perspective can be improved. We need to see the private sector taking on a lot more responsibility in terms of doing job creation. A lot of the private sector can contribute by doing, yes, youth employment service. That's an easy way to solve a problem, but at the same time to create jobs, which government has already incentivized. From a civil society, we've seen civil society. Civil society is one of the biggest creation of jobs. But civil society has been throttled, no funding. Civil society is really struggling under the constraints of no resources or limited resources. So any jobs created in those spaces is really lost. Another area that we could look at is agriculture. Look at agriculture. Agriculture is consistently showing that it can create jobs. And so the question is, what are we doing to encourage young people to look at the full value chain of agriculture, amongst other things?
Thank you so much for your input. Onyi Nwaneri is the CEO at Afrika Tikkun, reacting to that rise in South Africa's unemployment rate at 32.9% and a concern when it comes to the joblessness of the youth in this country.